At Home in Times of War. Chapter 10. At home in times of war. Having been brought up in a quiet farming community with little exposure to big cities, I was totally unprepared for the instability, riots and uncertainties which we would face in Lebanon. It would, however, become a normal part of daily life. These events made one realize how uncertain life really was. In 1958, the year before we arrived in Lebanon, there had been a bloody revolution that engulfed the entire nation. However, things had settled down by the time we arrived in 1959, but as we soon discovered, instability was never far away. We would need to look to the Lord for our tranquility of mind and soul, because outwardly there would be so much to disturb that feeling of safety. Thou wilt keep him in perfect peace whose mind is stayed upon thee. Isaiah 26:3. I remember an event in April 1965 that illustrated this truth to us. There had been some bloody rioting in Tripoli that put the entire country on edge. A couple of days after these events, a car struck a pedestrian just before coming to an army checkpoint that had been set up for this current turmoil in the Qub area of Tripoli. The soldiers whistled for the driver to stop, but he kept going. So one of the soldiers fired, missing the driver but hitting the young man next to him. The young man died instantly. This young man had attended our church 3 times and had accepted Christ as his Savior. They found a date book in his pocket with the following Wednesday marked, "Attend Faith Baptist Church." It impressed upon us how uncertain life was and how important it was that we redeem all opportunities. 139 Cast Your Bread. Arab-Israeli War. June 1967. I do not remember anything unusual about Monday, June 5, 1967, except that it was an ordinary summer day. That is, until about 11 o'clock when we heard that war had broken out between Israel and the Arab countries. All banks and airports were closed, and a complete blackout was ordered for the nights. As ordered, we put blue plastic over any window that would reveal light to the outside. Our little girls thought this was really exciting, though we felt an eerie apprehensive feeling. Along with cheering crowds lining the streets, I watched Lebanese army trucks loaded with troops rumble through Tripoli on their way to the southern front of Lebanon. With great emotion the crowds would cry, "We are returning." That is, we are going back to Palestine to retake it for its former inhabitants. The second day brought more news of Arab successes on the battlefield, but that did not stop the civilians from hoarding foodstuffs for the coming days of suspense. Then it was announced that American and British planes were intervening in the battle on Israel's behalf. One said, the sky was so thick with planes that it darkened the light of the sun. This emotionally packed bit of news set the stage for the American government, as well as other governments, to ask its citizens to leave the Arab countries. We really had no thought of leaving during this war, although many foreigners were evacuated. However, some prominent Lebanese friends came to our home expressing their strong conviction that we should go. They called the Lebanese General Security that also advised our going. This advice was given because it had been announced that Lebanon was breaking diplomatic ties with America because of the strong belief that America had actively intervened in fighting with the enemy, and because of this we could be held as prisoners of war. The American embassy had evacuated over 2,000 the night before, among them the other missionaries. So on the basis that we might be taken prisoners of war, we decided to leave. We had 2 hours to pack, get our house ready to leave and make arrangements for the church. It was so hard for us to leave this way, not knowing what was going to happen, and how long we would be gone. We cried all the way to the Beirut airport that Thursday afternoon. Well, the Lord knew our hearts were and would be gracious to us by shortening our absence from Lebanon. We arrived in Athens that night on the last plane out of Lebanon, number 15 for the day. Just before arriving, though, we discovered that all we had heard about the progress of the war was inaccurate and that the Israelis had all but 140 at home in times of war won the war. It was a rude shock that we found hard to believe. While in Athens we saw the Acropolis as well as Corinth, which was most interesting. Also, the Corinthian Canal was a beautiful sight with both the Aegean and Ionian seas in sight, joined by that excavated royal gorge. All of the time coming back to Athens from Corinth was spent in witnessing to our Greek guide, a 38-year-old single lady. By the way, we attended a Greek evangelical church the Sunday we were in Athens. Although I understood only a word here and there in modern Greek, I was able to sing with them amazingly well. It was so enjoyable even though I had left the Greek language long ago after college days. And I was simply fascinated by the Greeks' beautiful singing. As it later turned out, Lebanon did not completely break diplomatic ties as it had been announced. Also, the war was shockingly short, so the danger of being prisoners of war did not materialize. On Monday morning we found that the Beirut airport was being opened to traffic. The American embassy informed us that we couldn't go back, but the Lebanese embassy said that they had no restrictions on our re-entering the country. The Lebanese airlines informed us that their first flight into Lebanon since the war began would be leaving in 3 hours' time. So it was clear that we could return and that the reasons for which we left Lebanon were no longer meaningful. Thus we made the decision to return. Within 3 hours we were on a plane bound for Beirut. We were so glad to get back to Tripoli. There had been huge and violent demonstrations the Saturday of our absence. Some said that 10,000 demonstrators surged through the Tripoli streets alone. Though much damage was done, we were so thankful that none of our homes or churches were bothered. The Tripoli church brethren were afraid for us when they came to see us and insisted that we not leave home for at least 2 or 3 weeks. They brought us food and anything else we needed so that we could remain invisible to the public. It was an eerie feeling, but it was good to be back home. I commented to Kathleen that this was the last time we were going to leave during a war. That determination would someday become a burden to us when things really got bad and when we should leave. An abundance of rumors went around while we were gone from Lebanon those 4 days during the 1967 war. It was told that we were spies and that the government had seized a recorder and transmitter, that went tick 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 in our basement, and had deported us from the country. Many other stories were 141 cast your bread floating around also. However, when we reappeared 4 days after leaving, it really threw a kink into those tall tales. We really got a good laugh out of it. The people who created those tales had thought we would be gone a long time. One man who made up some of those stories wouldn't look us in the face. I would have liked to ask him if he still was hearing that tick-tick from our basement. Well, some folks like to talk. Proverbs says, "He that keepeth his mouth keepeth his soul from troubles." My purpose in relating this information is this: is mission work affected in such conditions? If so, how? Our ministry was certainly limited in some aspects for a time after the war. Frankly, many didn't want us around, afraid of what other people would say about them. The general psychology was this: America is helping Israel, you are an American, therefore, you are helping Israel. This is common all over the world and certainly not peculiar to the Middle East. So we found that our presence in many places was more of a hindrance than a help, at least for a few months after the war. But God, whose plans are never thwarted, gave us the most profitable summer ministry we had ever experienced in Lebanon. Conditions in Lebanon did return to normal, as near to normal as they would get. True, many people would never listen to what we said because of their suspicions and misunderstanding of who we were and what we were doing. This, combined with the ecumenical movement in full swing, presented a dark picture, humanly speaking, for our existence in the Middle East. But God, who opened Lydia's heart, was still able to open hearts and doors to us. He is still in control. But regardless of these difficulties, the work of God will go on. God has a job for each of us to do, and will keep us in our place until that job is done. I have set before thee an open door, and no man can close it. Revelation 3:8. A 16-year war during our 17 years in Lebanon, we had never seen anything like this. We were cut off from the outside world. There was no mail, telegraph, and much of the time no telephone out of the country. Banks and businesses were also closed. For a time it had been almost impossible to get gasoline or cooking gas, and many people could not even get sufficient food. Thank God we had plenty 142 at home in times of war to eat. One of the village ladies showed Kathleen how to cook outside on a kindling fire at the camp where we were staying temporarily. Please do not misunderstand me as I recall the events that were daunting to us during our months, not years, of this terrible civil war. Our beloved Lebanese people, along with other Arabic peoples from other countries, suffered for long years and do not deserve to be compared to our little experiences. The experiences of these dear brethren and how God intervened for them would fill many books to overflowing. For an example, I will relate the story of a godly father whom God provided for him and his family during the war and in times of persecution. They, and despite of the dire conditions they were going through, experienced obvious God's provision in their lives and ministry and faithfulness to Him who loved them as He loved His children, who experienced His presence in the midst of atrocities and difficulties. Very simply, these events were, nonetheless, big to us, a danger, not before experienced, to which our God intervened in such an obvious way. It is that faithful, divine intervention which we wish to paint before the reader's eyes. Whatever one's experience, our faithful God is there to help. God brought down the massive walls of Jericho, and He saved little Rahab. He also spared little Richard Hester in an ambush near Little Deir. Clouds of war enveloping Lebanon LN. By maintaining this focus, may the Lord use these stories to encourage all of us to trust God more. Chronicle of events leading to our departure. Friends offered to bring me a Kalashnikov to keep in my house so we could protect ourselves. I declined the offer. I can't protect my family in such a war, only God can do that. And I want everybody to know that I don't have guns in the house. People who had guns were not being able to defend themselves. 143 Cast your bread successfully. So the best thing was to flee to God for refuge. Some missionaries in bad situations might see it differently, and that's okay by me. In our situation, I just felt safer having God than I did having weapons. A Lebanese war joke was told about a man who was buying merchandise from a market where stolen goods were being sold for a fraction of their value. He had a pile of goods but wanted to get something else. He could not leave the pile of stolen goods he had purchased, so he hired an honest-looking young man to guard his goods. When he returned, the honest-looking young man and his goods were not to be found. He began to shout and curse, saying, "What a shame! You can't trust anybody anymore." And truly you couldn't. Our home was on the outskirts of Tripoli, but even it was not safe at the height of the fighting. We were working at the camp when hostilities erupted, and we stayed there during this time. I thought it was a good time to complete some projects at the camp. We hired a Caterpillar tractor to dig and level a playing field for soccer or other games. We also had them dig a deep pit for making an underground water reservoir for the camp. Because of the threat to his life, the owner of the Caterpillar fled the area and left the expensive tractor parked just outside our camp. Local Catholic villagers from up the valley came and began to take off valuable parts from it. Armed men with AK-47 Kalashnikovs were guarding them while they worked at their theft. Impatience rebuked missionary Clyde Ains was able to get to the camp to help me build forms for a large retaining wall by the playing field. We needed common laborers who could mix the concrete by hand and carry it to the wall forms where we poured it over large rocks for the 15-inch concrete wall. I went down the mountain to the village square where such laborers congregated. The war was taking ugly turns with religious overtones. The Muslim workers agreed to go collect their gear and come with me to stay and work at the camp, but they did not return. After several attempts with different laborers and encountering the same problem, Kathleen and I prayed in the car. It was getting dark, and it was wartime. We could not understand why our attempts to use our time profitably in completing these camp projects were falling on their faces. Frankly, I was frustrated and a bit put out. 144 at home in times of war. Finally, I thanked the Lord anyway, and we left to go back to the camp where our daughters were waiting for us. As I gunned the car up the steep mountain road in the darkness, Kathleen screamed, "Richard, those are men with guns." At the same moment I saw them standing by the road waving for me to stop. One came up from the side and butted his gun against my head and said, "Who are you?" "I am the Qasis, name for pastor by which I am known, and I live up at the top of that mountain where you see the light flickering." The men seemed satisfied and said, "Get going." I didn't argue and stomped the accelerator to the floor. The next morning the news came that the roadblock checkpoint was looking for Muslims. Had I gotten my way and brought Muslim workers with me, they would have been taken from my car and killed or kidnapped. Other Muslims were caught and killed that same night. So my frustration from the thwarting of my plans to be efficient and productive in my work was totally misguided. I bowed my head in tears and thanked God that He did not let me have my way. What a cross it would have been to carry on my conscience the remainder of my life. The obstacle was God's gracious roadblock to His sincere but ignorant servant to spare him and others great harm. My irritating delay was God's gracious appointment. Kathleen's scare one day while we were still working at the camp in the mountains. Things were quiet in the areas down by our home, so Kathleen and Shirlene, our second daughter, drove down to our home to get some needed supplies. Armed men blew up a gas station and murdered several people near our home. Kathleen and Shirlene were coming out of our neighbor's house, going back across the road to our home, when these armed men came through the area. Gunfire flared. Immediately they followed the neighbor to the protection of his parked car. While he and his bodyguard were ready to exchange fire with the gunman, Kathleen and Shirlene huddled on the ground against the front tire of his car. After 15 minutes the shooting stopped, and it seemed safe for them to return to the neighbor's house to wait for a bit before running across the street to our home while the neighbor and his bodyguard covered them with their automatic assault rifles. Kathleen commented, "Boy, we got our things fast and returned to the camp as quickly as we could." 145 Cast Your Bread Summer Camp was held a couple of weeks before the fury of war was unleashed, first upon Tripoli, then a couple of weeks later on Beirut also. During the September skirmishes, Faith Baptist Church barely missed being bombed. I had given a man who lived across the street from the church permission to plant a small garden on the church property. Protecting his interest, he intervened with guerrillas intent upon planting bombs around the church structure. He paid them $10 to leave and take their explosives with them. Descent into chaos. Law and order were non-existent. We never believed that Lebanon could see such days. Nevertheless, God was still over all, and we were asking Him to lead us each day. We had a ministry in spite of the prevailing conditions. Services were continuing in a home in a nearby village. Some of the members fled from their homes in Tripoli. We didn't know when they would be able to return. It seemed so sad that the church was locked up in Tripoli, but we could not get there safely. Such conditions brought us down to the basics, the things that really counted. Sickness or tragedy highlights what is really important. Quite a number of Americans' nationalities. All of our friends were bullet-in-car doorpost, 1975, evacuated as well as other foreign gone. We were thankful that we were able to remain and carry on our ministry even though it seemed quite limited at times. Visitation at night in Tripoli was out, and some areas were off limits all the time. Services were still at the village home, and Sunday school was in our backyard or under the carport roof if it were raining. The Lord gave us 44 in Sunday school that particular Sunday. The children were memorizing Psalms 23. A couple of years before the war, our children's Sunday school reached a high of 103, but things were completely different now. 146 at home in times of war. In November 1975, security conditions again tumbled into chaos and the war took a bizarre turn for the unbelievable worse. Despair engulfed the entire country. Hope was so far away that this conflict could ever be resolved. What would be the end of this beautiful country now so scarred by war and violence? Our personal situation was becoming even more precarious. Fighting broke out up toward the mountains, and for the first time we were cut off from access to the mountains and our camp, which was serving as a place of refuge for us and others. Even the small area around our home was involved in serious incidents. But God would have to shake us severely before we would even consider leaving. None of us wanted to leave. Lebanon was our home, our life, and our ministry. Kathleen said, "Richard isn't the kind that leaves. The American Embassy says the worst thing we could do is to stay too long, and I am beginning to think that Richard may be one of those who stays too long. But God would show us His will." How many times we had prayed, "Teach me thy way, O Lord, and lead me in a plain path, because of mine enemies." As we mentioned, freedom of movement had been greatly curtailed. The freedom to be able to go anywhere at any time was gone. We could not easily get to the church. The Sunday school rooms were silent with no students and no teaching of the Word of God. The pulpit and the church were empty and foreboding. There was a war. There were no young people and the pastor standing outside the church passing out tracts and inviting people to come into the service to hear of God's love for them. Streets were empty except for armed men and racing jeeps of militias. Shops were closed. War lurked everywhere. Our hearts felt sick and perplexed, wondering what would come next. We thought of how we take all these things for granted: stability, freedom of movement and freedom to serve. We don't appreciate their value until they are taken from us. Kidnapping incident. The Lord wonderfully saved me from a serious kidnapping incident in Tripoli. It was 3 o'clock in the afternoon, and I was walking alone down the sidewalk in the Kora Square. I noticed an armed leftist guerrilla with hand grenades swaying from his belt and an AK-47 automatic Kalashnikov slung over his shoulder. I sensed that he was definitely following me, so I quickened my walk, hoping to lose him, jump into my car and avoid a confrontation. But the man 147 cast your bread was not to be deterred. I realized that I was an obvious target, a hated American. I would be truly a big catch and an easy one. I slid quickly into the car, but he stuck his head into the car. My heart began to pound, and I broke out into a cold sweat. Observant shopkeepers saw what was happening, but they turned their heads and retreated back into their shops, fearing that any involvement would only put them in danger. I prayed, "Lord, this is it. You have to intervene. I need you now." I could hardly believe my own eyes at how the Lord did intervene. When the man asked me where I lived, it was as if someone was confusing the man's mind. He seemed to be stunned, his whole demeanor suddenly changed. For some unexplainable reason the armed man decided I was an associate of two politically inclined Muslim doctors who lived in the same area where we lived. He seemed to fear displeasing them. His actions were also weird. Weird but exceedingly beautiful. Beautiful because I knew beyond any shadow of a doubt that my great God had mercifully hedged about his poor, trembling servant and had delivered him from this sinister fate that was befalling multiplied thousands in that ugly war. How many times had I sat in my car waiting at a roadblock, praying that those manning it would be sympathetic and not hostile to me. I saw people being taken out of their cars and marched down into a ravine. Many were killed on the spot, others were held as hostages to be used as human pawns. Newspapers were filled with pictures of missing family members, placed by families or relatives begging anyone for information about loved ones who had disappeared. Murder in Tripoli. The German cultural attaché was abducted from his home in Tripoli, taken out and murdered. Shortly after we left the country, armed leftist guerrillas came to our home searching for me. Had I still been there, who knows what would have happened. Little babies were being abducted from their cribs and taken out, their heads bashed against concrete walls, killing them. Later armed men were going around to homes in Tripoli, intimidating people and displaying chopped up pieces of human bodies on big platters to frighten the populace. 148 At home in times of war, a hair-splitting scrape with death. The angel of the Lord encampeth round about them that fear him, and delivereth them. I went to make a visit in a safe area in a village up above our home at 7 in the evening. Kathleen was planning to accompany me on the visit, but she felt strangely sick 30 minutes before we were to go. So I told her to stay home and I would make the visit alone. No one was on the road as I drove slowly through the Christian village. Suddenly I heard a voice shout, "Stop," and I immediately hit the brakes, though I never dreamed that it was a hidden roadblock of armed men. But even my quick braking was not quick enough for those men. 3 of them opened fire with AK-47 Kalashnikov assault rifles. Bullets pierced the doorpost like a blowtorch. I threw myself down on the floor. It seemed that my whole life passed through my mind in fast motion. I prayed, "Thank you, Lord. I am yours. Whatever you want to do with me, I accept, whether you take me or spare me." I felt a surrounding, supernatural peace such as I had never felt before or since. A bullet literally ruffled the hair just above my left ear. Like a big tin can, bullets were banging through the car. My right hand was grazed and sustained a very slight wound. Shrapnel fell on the floor beside my head. The doorpost at head level was half cut in two. The bullet punctures in the car and motor, in the tire and its rim, the broken glass all meant nothing. The important thing was that the Lord had miraculously delivered me in this hair-splitting scrape with death from such an obvious certain fate. The gentlemen were shooting to kill. Death looked me squarely in the face, but my great God again released me from its strong clutches. Bullet holes in car, 1975. The three armed and hooded men approached my car, sure that I was dead. How could I have survived the over 30 bullets pumped into my car at such close range? After the shooting stopped, I could hear the voices of the villagers in the distance. So I sat up in the car. The shocked armed men blurted out, "You're 149, cast your bread, lucky you didn't get killed, you should have stopped." I was almost sure they knew who I was, probably even before they opened fire, because my car was well known in the area. "Turn off the lights, get out and get down on the ground." I turned the lights off and tried to open the door but couldn't because of the bullet damage to the doorpost. Again, "Get out." Fearing another volley of bullets, I said loudly, "How can I get down on the ground if I can't even get the door open?" Finally the armed men left, and the villagers helped push the car to an open space where it could be bandaged up enough to get me home. Suddenly a Mercedes with the armed men, now 6, screeched to a halt by my car. The 4 doors flew open, and the 6 men jumped out, shouting, "Search his car, he has weapons in it." That village never was very responsive to my evangelistic efforts in it. But in the darkness that night, a voice spoke up, "Search his car all you want. You won't find anything except Bibles." I secretly thanked God for that faceless testimony to what we had tried to do in that village. Following the search, I witnessed to those 6 armed and hooded men. Surprisingly, they stood quietly and listened as I spoke. "You are not happy doing what you are doing and living in this manner. Only Christ can give you peace and forgiveness of sin." They only listened and didn't say a word. At the end, I offered to bring each one of them a Bible if they would give me their names and addresses. Of course, they wouldn't do that. They were hooded to hide their identities. The armed men left, and the villagers, sympathetic to me, began to apologize for the incident. We got the car running, and I drove home. With my wife and girls kneeling beside me, we thanked God with tears that He had graciously protected their father and husband. We also praised the Lord that He stopped Kathleen from going with me that night. Both of us would have been shot and perhaps killed since neither of us would have been able to get down on the floor of the car. After I had left for the visit, the strange sick feeling disappeared, and Kathleen was fine. Even the evil intent of wicked men can be made to praise our God. Even that night I was able to boast to those armed men of the wonderful Savior whom I served. But another wonderful opportunity was yet to come. 2 days later one of the men who tried to kill me was wounded with a leg shot up. He was brought to the hospital 1 block from our home. The night of the ambush incident I had no idea who the armed men were, and even though we were driving around 150 at home in times of war in a shot-up car, no one was commenting on the identity of the armed men. However, the doctor at the hospital told me that one of those men was now in the hospital, and the doctor had performed surgery on him the day before. He said he knew what the man had done to me, and the doctor cut down the anesthetic to pay him back for what he had done. I determined to visit him and give him a Bible. The doctor, not a religious man, said that would really be a noble thing to do. When I walked into the gunman's hospital room, his young wife was sitting by his bedside. Believe me, his eyes really got big. In those days of war, anyone else would have gunned him down in his bed to get revenge. But I didn't come for revenge. Instead, the love of Christ constraineth us, 2 Cor 5:14. I took the wonderful opportunity to give him a New Testament and to witness to him of Christ's great love, forgiveness, and peace. I then prayed for his speedy recovery. All of this happened before Thanksgiving Day. Though we had no turkey and trimmings, we had a great day rejoicing in the Lord's good blessings. Later we would have to leave Lebanon. About 6 months after visiting this young man in the hospital, I received word that this same young man had been killed in a theft he was carrying out. I felt heartsick for 2 days, as if I had lost a brother or worse. I grieved because I had desperately hoped that my witness to him might be used to turn him from his evil ways. Apparently, it did not. Yet another 17 years would elapse, and another chapter would unfold from this amazing ambush story. Damage inside the church. 1975 bombing of Faith Baptist Church. There seemed to be more to come, and we were beginning to feel that God was definitely leading us to consider leaving for a time, until things would take a definite turn for the better. December 6, 1975, on a Saturday morning at 1 o'clock, I was still awake when a large explosion seemed to shake the whole area. There were other explosions at the time and also lots of shooting. We later 151 Cast Your Bread entrance doors blown out, 1975 Tripoli church bombed, 1975 found out that armed terrorists, thought to be funded by outside sources, were systematically bombing 28 of the big, expensive shops on the fashionable Azmi Street where our church had previously rented premises. Somehow I felt sure that our church had been hit, but I prayed and tried to commit it to the Lord. I told him that he knew our hopes and prayers for this great city and that our church building was a meaningful symbol of the good news we had proclaimed there and of what we were trying to do. Of course, I could not go at night to check, but the phone rang at 6 o'clock that morning with word that the church, indeed, had been bombed. A good bit of costly damage was sustained, but we were so thankful that the basic construction was undamaged. The wood entrance with the big double doors was completely destroyed. Only 2 panes of the colored glass in the windows were intact. We nailed up the entrance and doors with big sheets of galvanized tin and left the other damage to be repaired after the war would settle and peace would return. Decision to leave. Many other things happened which the Lord used and which seemed to say so plainly to us that we must leave for now. I could not keep my family in this situation any longer. Our people and our friends were telling us we should leave, that it was not safe for us to stay. The decision was made to leave, but the Lord would have to miraculously put the pieces together. As we were at 152 at home in times of war, a travel agency trying to arrange plane tickets from Damascus to New York, an armed guerrilla with his Kalashnikov gun and a hand grenade walked He was enamored with our blonde daughter Melody, who was speaking Arabic. He proceeded to show her the hand grenade and how it worked, thoroughly enjoying himself. Neither Melody nor I were enjoying the demonstration. The agent succeeded in making a reservation, a miracle in itself, but it was a whole week earlier than we wanted. We had no idea how we could leave so quickly, but we decided to try. Perhaps God had a purpose in giving us the earlier date. We only had a short time to arrange our affairs. We would take little luggage. The more valuable things, like all the ministry materials, Sunday school literature, young people's programs that were translated into Arabic, files and important papers, important or valuable household effects and personal belongings, things with sentimental value like photo albums and 8mm films, would be stored in the safest place possible, the camp. Our car was left with friends in the village near the camp. Our hearts were heavy and fearful. It was a bitter, cold wintry day when we packed it all at the camp, which was in a Christian area, locked the door securely and prayed that God in His mercy would look after it. No one else could do so. Seeing people fleeing with as many possessions as they could carry, searching for a safe place, realizing that no place was really safe, gave one a helpless feeling. We felt so helpless to protect anything. The sad liftoff the Beirut airport was closed, as well as the road to Beirut. Our only way out of the country was to drive north to the border with Syria and then around to Damascus by car. Thankfully, things were quiet the morning of our departure, and we put our few pieces of luggage into a taxi driver and drove away. When the plane lifted off the Damascus runway, a lump formed in our throats, and tears welled up in our eyes. Somehow, I felt this departure was different than any we had experienced before. I wasn't sure why. When we arrived in New York, Friday, December 12, 1975, I called my mother, from whom we had been cut off for some time. "Mom, this is Richard, we're O.K." When she heard my voice, she began to cry. "Richard, I never worried about you. I just knew that God was going to take care of you. And He did." 153